there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Conan Graves Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're asking the question of why did Russia invade Ukraine? Now I know that this video for many of you were expecting it to be on the Stuarts and what if the Stuarts never ruled England? That's going to be for next week. I thought that after the video from last week and because of everything that's going on right now with regards to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think that it's very important for me to kind of cover this. And actually the video which I did last week, it was looking at the history of Ukraine and it was explaining kind of some of the wider context. But actually for people who don't really follow the news much or don't really know a lot of the backstory and stuff, it didn't actually explain why has Russia invaded Ukraine right now. So this hopefully will present more of an argument for it and kind of looking at it more from the Russian perspective. Now, undoubtedly this can be accused of bias, but the thing is, as I've kind of said to people, everyone has biases and stuff. And the thing is, if you're only looking at things from one perspective, you're also going to be quite biased and stuff, right? So the way to kind of counter bias is by understanding things from both perspectives, and also bearing in mind that most people who kind of access the news, in whatever country they're in, they tend to follow the mainstream news, and that whether it's Russia or whether it's America or whether it's Britain, it's a thing where people in the mainstream, they will present the talking points from the establishment, right? So RT for Russia will basically kind of say the Russian line, BBC will say the British line, like CNN will say the American line. So when people talk about bias, if you're looking at these as objective kind of news sources, they're not, right? So anything that you're going to see is going to be from a certain standpoint. So much of the coverage in the West has been pro-Ukraine, much of the coverage in Russia has been pro-Russian, right? But most people in the West, most of the people watching this, it's a Western audience, most of them will not have ever heard of things from the Russian perspective. And so for them, they're like, why has Putin done this? He's just some evil, crazy guy, he just wants to take over random countries, right? So this video hopefully is aimed at people who don't have much of an understanding of it and are kind of just looking at this what's going on, right? So further ado, we're going to kind of dive into the history and a little bit of the geography of Russia, and hopefully after this video you'll get a better perspective of why Putin has done what he's done, basically. So first of all, talking about the geography of Russia, right? So Russia is the largest country on earth when it comes to territory. However, most of its population is kind of centered in this kind of heartland, right? So historically, this is where the land of the Kievan Rus was pretty much based out of. So this is the founding blocks of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, which we discussed in the last video. Definitely check that out. But this territory here, this is the part of Russia that the administration really care about, and this is what they really want to protect, right? But surrounding it, it's very difficult to defend. But if you have control over it, then it's then you have Russia, right? You can see this, for instance, in the Russian Civil War. So just after the revolution, when the communists took over, right? The White Army, so the anti-communists, they had all the territory that was surrounding this heartland, but it didn't matter because the Bolsheviks, the communists, they had control over the Russian heartland, and so they were able to win that war and basically set up the Soviet Union, right? So that's why having control over this heartland is so important, but geography is not the best friend of the Russians, right? And so in the words of, I believe, Catherine the Great, she said that the only way for Russia to protect its borders is to expand those borders, right? So talking about Russia, so to the north of this heartland, you pretty much just have, the Arctic Circle, right? So although Russia has a very long coastline, it's actually not very accessible, right? So trade, even to this day, trade is really done by the sea travel, right? So if you control the ports and stuff and you control the coastline, then that's really important when it comes to trade and exporting and importing, etc., right? And also just for national defense is also very good, right? Because then you can project your force outside of your own borders, right? So when it comes to the Arctic Ocean, it's a thing of some of these ports either frozen all year round, or it's a thing where it falls out in summer, right? So in winter it freezes over. So this is not what we call a warm water port. A warm water port is a port which stays open and unfrozen throughout the whole year. So that's really what Russia wants, and that's what it needs in terms of being a secure power, being a good trading power, and just for it to be a serious kind of force in the world, right? So that's the situation with regard to the north. Then when you look eastwards, right, so okay, you have the Ural Mountains here, which are a good kind of like defensive block. However, yeah, you have like a gap, which is basically where kind of Kazakhstan is now, and this is where the Mongol invasion like came through, right? You know, so like obviously the Russians were occupied by the Mongols, so for them they're very like worried about an attack from the east. That's why they pushed as far like into Siberia and like took all of Siberia, like, you know, because they want to basically secure as much of this as possible so that they can't ever get attacked from the east again, right? And also, at a later point, they end up like taking what's now like the area around Vladivostok. They end up taking that from the Chinese in 1860. We covered that in our video about the scramble for China. So you could argue whether they necessarily needed to kind of take this territory, because Vladivostok, as far as I'm aware, is a warm water port, but at the same time, it's a thing where actually it's quite difficult to defend. And in the long run, you know, you have roughly about 4 million Russians that live like in that region, compared to about 100 million Chinese people who live very close to that border. So actually, it's a thing where in the long run, that part of Siberia is not probably the best yet. And like China, even to this day, although it has close relationships with Russia, it still wants that territory back. So you can argue whether it was wise for them to necessarily take that. But then when we talk about the stands, so this is basically Central Asia, it makes a lot of sense to obviously have Kazakhstan. Whether it makes sense to kind of push forward like further south, like kind of that's a kind of different question and stuff. But regardless, Russia pushed forward into there and kind of took all this land, which is like, you know, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, etc., etc. In Central Asia, it's a thing where Uzbekistan, although on the map it looks quite small, it actually has almost half of the population of the entire stands, yeah, right, because it's very fertile land there, etc., etc. So, you know, if you're worried about an attack from the south, you're Russia, it makes sense, I suppose, like to kind of like take this territory. And then if you look at southern Russia, right, so south of Russia you have the Caucasus and you have the Caspian Sea, right? So the Caucasus, you know, the mountain range there, it's important to have control over like the kind of the mountain passes there, and also the Caspian Sea, you know, it has like kind of natural resources like oil and gas and stuff, so it's important to kind of like have access to all of that to secure that. But also the Caucasus were a good barrier between what was then a Russian Empire and what was then like the Ottoman Empire, right? So the Ottoman Empire is pretty much Turkey, right? So the southern part of the Black Sea now, right, that is controlled by the Turks, right? And historically, like nearly all of the Black Sea was controlled by the Ottomans. So it was really important for the Russians to advance southwards and to take these Black Sea ports. In particular, within Crimea, you have Sevastopol. So that was very, very important for the Russians to have control over that, right? So, you know, that explains like kind of like the south part of Russia. But then if you look to the west, right, so first of all, in terms of having a control over the Baltic Sea, so Peter the Great, he ended up founding the city of St. Petersburg, and he changed the capital of Russia from being Moscow to St. Petersburg because he wanted Russia to become more of a European country, wanted to trade more with Europe. But it was also really important that if you have that city there, yes, you can trade with like what's going on in the Baltic, but at the same time, if you don't have enough control over the Baltic Sea, then it becomes a thing where whoever's the dominant power there is then able to hamper like trade and stuff, and etc., etc. So if you're going to have control over the Baltic, you need to have control of as much of it as possible, right, to kind of secure things, right? And then also, this is the main thing, yeah. This is like the main so-called chink in the Russians' armor, right? And this is the so-called North European plain. Now, in geography terms, this is pretty much, you know, going all the way from like, you know, the English Channel to the Ural Mountains. This is pretty much flat land, right? This is flat territory, and it's a thing of, you know, it's very difficult to defend this because it's not like many like natural barriers, like there's a few rivers and stuff, but it's a thing of, you know, you can basically have an army marching all the way from Paris all the way to Moscow without too much trouble. And this is what you found with the invasion of Napoleon. We did a video on that, definitely check that out. And also what you see in World War I and in World War II with the Germans, right? So Russia is very conscious of this, right? Because this is a great conduit for invaded armies, yeah, to attack Russia. Like they go along this plain here, and also with the North European plain, across France and Germany and Poland and stuff, it's quite a narrow gap. But then by the time it gets to Ukraine, it kind of opens up here, right? So this is what you find like in many like wars and stuff, in particular in World War II. It's very difficult for like the Russians to basically defend any of the kind of territory here, because the front line ends up being so vast, and you don't know where the Germans are going to attack. You don't know where any like kind of like invaded army is going to attack, and so you want to have as much control of the North European plain as far west as possible if you're looking at it from Russia's perspective. So talking about the history of it, right? So you had basically the Germans have always had this idea of a Drang nach Osten. So this is a so-called drive for the east, right? This is the thing of they wanted to have control over Ukraine. They wanted to have control over much of the territory, which is like like if not Russia in its entirety, at least they want to have control over the states which are to the west of Russia, right? So Belarus and Ukraine and all that kind of stuff, right? Very fertile farmland, and so if you have control over that, then that's really good from like a European kind of standpoint, right? So the Russians have always been kind of like worried about this kind of Drang nach Osten, from whatever Western power is like a major threat on its western frontier, right? So if we look here at this map, right, we can see that by 1855, Russia pretty much had all the territory that it needed to defend itself, right? So yes, as we said before, did they really need to take the land like south of Kazakhstan? Did they really need to take the land which is now around like Vladivostok, like from the Chinese? You can kind of argue that, but the thing is, certainly on their western frontier, they had control over Finland and the Baltic states. So that means that now they are the dominant Baltic power. And also they had control over Poland, which stretches quite far west, right? So now, like any army that's invading from there, it's now a much narrower point, so it's much more easy for them to defend against any attack from the west, right? And also, as we can see, their control over the Caucasus and control over the whole of like Ukraine and stuff, right? So from a Russian perspective, this was like a really good kind of like defensive block, and any Russian administration ideally wants to have this, right? And if they have the power to project there, this is what they are aiming for, right? So in World War I, the Germans were more technologically advanced than the Russians, and so they were able to basically destroy the Russian army. So one of the things that the new Bolshevik government was pushing for was peace, because their slogan was peace, land and bread, right? So for them, they was like, we want peace with the Germans at any cost, right? So in the so-called Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, right, what ended up happening is that the Germans exacted a really terrible blow for the Russians, because they basically said, right, all of this territory here, we want this to be like independent states, and they're basically going to be German puppets, and so you're not going to have control over this kind of region stuff, right? So this was the price which the Bolsheviks paid for making peace with the Germans then. So obviously the Germans ended up losing World War I, but the Russians, they were able to take back some of that territory, but for instance, they weren't able to retake Poland, they weren't able to retake Finland, etc. So this meant that Russia, which by then was the Soviet Union, didn't have great defenses on its western borders, right? So they tried to kind of stop this a little bit before World War II kind of started for them. So like, in the same way that the Germans were like, they advanced into Poland, the Russians went into Poland, they took like Baltic states, they took like what's now Moldova. So they advanced further into what the territory had been before with like the Tsarist Empire, and they did try to take Finland, although they were unsuccessful in the Winter War, right? So what ended up happening then was that the Germans invaded, right? Now, the gap between where the Germans were and where Moscow was, was 1,100 kilometers, or about 700 miles. So the Germans pushed through all of this territory here and got to the very gates of Moscow. They got within, I believe, something like 5 miles from the city center. So the Germans were pushed back, right? But then in the following year, 1942, the Germans then were like, okay, what we're going to do is focus more on Ukraine, and we're going to focus on Stalingrad, which is now the city of Volgograd, right? So there's the so-called Volgograd gap. So this is the kind of gap between what's now Ukraine and Volgograd, right? So if you take this territory here, it's a very small gap, but you basically cut Russia in half. And as we said before, this is where a lot of like the oil and gas was, right? So this was vital for the Soviet war effort. If the Germans had been able to take Stalingrad, they would have pretty much made sure that, yes, like the Russians could have carried on fighting, but their chance of actually winning the war would have been pretty much impossible. And actually it was a thing where the Russians, at great cost, of like almost 27 million people, they caused 90% of the German casualties in World War II. So the reason why we're not all speaking German is thanks to the sacrifice of the Russian and like the other kind of Soviet people and stuff, right? So that's something to kind of bear in mind. So the Russians end up pushing them all the way back and taking Berlin. And so Stalin, he thought, right, okay, we've gone through all this. What we need to do now is we need to secure this North European plain as far west as possible, right? So this meant that Soviet troops were occupying eastern Germany and all of the territories in between there, all of these states here which had been very hostile to the Soviets beforehand, they were now turned into Soviet puppet states, right? Now, the West, in response to all of this, were very worried because obviously, because the Russians are this far west along this North European plain, this meant that if they wanted to carry on attacking, and go to like Paris, they could feasibly do that, especially because the Soviet army was so huge, they could continue the push the much weaker Americans and the British. So in the same way they defeated the Germans, the fear was that they could defeat the Americans and the British. So this is the reason why the Western powers formed NATO, and so NATO was a defensive bloc to stop the spread of communism, to contain communism and to stop the Soviet threat. So that was the original stated aim of NATO. And the thing to kind of note is that, obviously you had the Cold War and stuff, and these states here, which were in the Soviet sphere of influence, didn't want to be part of the Soviet sphere of influence. They didn't want to be part of the Warsaw Pact, right? So what ended up happening is, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, first of all, you had the end of the Cold War in 1989. So the Berlin Wall came down, all these other countries kind of left the Warsaw Pact and stuff. So Russia's influence, greatly diminished at this point. And then in 1991, you end up having the final collapse of the Soviet Union, right? So all these different countries end up basically splitting away. So Ukraine split away, all these different places, right? So what ended up happening at this time was that you had massive societal, political, economic, just everything just ruined, so we covered this in our video about what if the Soviet Union never collapsed. Definitely check that video out. It's quite difficult to watch it at a certain point because it's a thing where the rate of suicide, the rate of alcoholism, the rate of just everything went through the roof at this time, and Russia really was on its knees, right? As a society, as a people, everything, it was completely on its knees. And so what would you expect the Americans and the other forces in NATO, to do, right? So this Cold War was fought, it was meant to be fought to contain communism. Russia is no longer communist. Its economy is broken, its people are broken. So after World War II, this is a point that Vladimir Poznan made, right? After World War II, the Americans and the British and stuff learnt the lesson from World War One and thought, right, we're not going to punish the Germans and the Japanese because otherwise, this is why Hitler ended up rising and stuff. This is why the imperialists in Japan ended up rising. So we're so we're going to have a fair peace and we're going to build up the economies of our former enemies, right? And we're going to get them to a point where, they're integrated within the capitalist system, they're integrated within the Western system, right? So this is what was done in the so-called Marshall Plan, so they rebuilt Germany after the war. However, there was no equivalent Marshall Plan after the end of the Cold War. So the West, just let Russia collapse in on itself, and then very triumphantly end up pushing further and further east. So this same kind of Dragnet Osten under different guise, end up happening, right? So looking at things from a Polish perspective, if I was Polish, yes, I would want to join NATO. It's obvious, because if you're any of these countries here, near to Russia, you're very worried about an advance of Russia. So I completely understand it from their perspective. But what one has to ask the question of is, why from an American perspective, why from a British perspective, would one allow these countries to join, right? If the point of NATO was to contain communism, as soon as communism is over, why is NATO still a thing? And why is it that 10 years afterwards, right, NATO allowed these countries to join, and then as the years went on, more and more countries were allowed to join? And when Russia asked, so first of all, you had Gorbachev asking, can we join NATO? And the Americans said, don't be silly. And then, fast forward now, to, when Vladimir Putin first came to office in 1999/2000, again, he asked, can Russia join NATO? And they said, lol, like, kind of like, don't be silly. So from a Russian perspective, it's quite difficult to look at NATO as anything other than a very triumphalist anti-Russian alliance, right? So if you're allowing all these countries to join this so-called defensive bloc, and then the one country which asked to join and you say no, how is that country supposed to kind of take things? Yeah, right. So that's basically that's kind of set the kind of like standard. That's kind of set the groundwork for what ended up happening nowadays, right? So in 2007, there's a really important speech here which Vladimir Putin does, and it's in Munich, right? There's a conference where they're talking about like kind of geopolitics, and he basically says within that speech that like Russia's basically had enough at this point. Yeah, they allowed these other countries to join NATO, and it seems more and more it's becoming more of this anti-Russian alliance, right? This is before he invades like Georgia, so before he does anything bad and stuff on the international stage, right? Yes, obviously domestically he might have done some things, but at this point in 2007, he was, he hadn't done anything wrong, like necessarily, right? So within that speech, he kind of said, well, we've kind of just had enough of it, right? And then the year after he does that speech, NATO invites Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO, and then and then obviously at some point like they can join like the EU as well. So Russia's like, no, we're not allowing that, right? So that's why you had the Russo-Georgian War in 2008. This is where Russia invades Georgia and then causes the breakaway of two split away like kind of republics. So you have Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and so this basically stops the Georgians from having any illusions that they are going to be able to join NATO, right? It just says, no, it's not happening. And Ukraine also going to take that message on board. So in 2010, you end up having a democratically elected government in Ukraine. And 4 years later, there ends up being a coup. Now, this coup was completely illegal, right? But it was supported by the West. So this is so-called Euromaidan, a coup. So this is basically where pro-NATO and pro-EU forces within Ukraine, predominantly within the western part of Ukraine, as we covered in our last video when we talked about the history of Ukraine and why the western, like the east, is different, right? However, many of the people who had voted for the president, who were in what's Novaya Russia, so like the south and eastern part of Ukraine, they were very hostile to it. And if there's a coup to overthrow a pro-Russian government, right, in Kiev, right? And I'm going to say Kiev because we don't say Moskva. That's, again, like, think about why people are now saying Kiev instead of Kiev, and they wouldn't ever say Moskva. Either way, that's a whole different like kettle of fish, but just bear that in mind when you see certain things, right? But anyway, so Russia at that time in 2014 was like, hold on. So Kiev is now going to go to NATO, right? Now we have the Russian Navy based in Sevastopol in Crimea, and so a hostile Ukraine is going to threaten not only that, but also they're going to threaten this Volgograd gap, which we've spoken about before. So the same way that the Germans were able to almost like cut the Soviet Union in half, this is the big fear that the Russians have here, that NATO forces, if you have a strong enough NATO army, they're going to be able to just march east a little bit and cut Russia in half. So Putin then decides, right, what we're going to do is we're going to take Crimea, we're going to take the Russian majority part of Crimea, and we're going to seize that, and then we're going to support the two breakaway republics, which is Donetsk and Luhansk. So these are, again, predominantly Russian-speaking people and stuff, right? Although not necessarily ethnically Russian, but yeah, so they end up like supporting them. And after 8 years of negotiation, the Ukrainians still haven't really budged on whether they would join NATO or not, right? And NATO hasn't really budged on whether or not they would allow Ukraine to join NATO. So they've not explicitly said that, yes, they will, but it's a thing of you still have a very hostile, Ukrainian government at the moment. So from a Russian perspective, they go, right, we've spent 8 years trying to negotiate with these people. And again, you can debate like kind of whether it's even their space to want to negotiate. I mean, obviously people are free to elect whatever kind of government they want and to have alliances wherever they want, etc., etc. So you can look at it from that perspective. But from Russia's perspective, it's a thing where they go, this is unacceptable. And what we're going to do is much in the same way that we did to Georgia, we're going to do a sharp hit on Ukraine. And we're going to, in the words of Putin, we're going to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Now, that's the speech that he gave on Thursday night, yeah, to kind of basically explain why he had done this recent invasion. Now, the thing with all that is, first of all, we have to like break down what he's trying to say. So he's kind of implying like kind of Godwin's law, right? And you can see the same thing with the Ukrainians as well. Everyone that people don't like is a Nazi, right? So he's basically saying that everyone in Ukraine who he doesn't like is a Nazi. So this invasion here is to denazify Ukraine, even though the president of Ukraine at the moment is Jewish. But anyway, that's a different story. So what he actually means by denazify thing is basically round up all the people, all the politicians, etc., who wanted to take Ukraine more towards NATO, basically put them on trial and imprison them. So basically he wants to like punish them in that sense, right? And then what he wants to do is he either wants to install a puppet regime in Ukraine, or he wants to, as it were, demilitarize Ukraine. So first of all, this is saying that, you know, from Russia's perspective, you know, Novaya, that's where like culturally a lot of people there are more like pro-Russian, and also this is where most of the industry of Ukraine is. This is, you know, so you have like much of the oil, much of the coal, much of like the heavy industry and stuff is out there. So the richer parts of Ukraine, yeah, the places where they have the highest GDP per capita are actually in the eastern part, right? So if you end up taking the virus here, you basically leave a very impoverished, a very weak, and a landlocked Ukraine, because you've taken Odessa, you've taken all this kind of place here. They have no access to the Black Sea, and so whatever's left of Ukraine isn't going to be any kind of threat. Whether that part joins NATO or not, it's irrelevant, because it's not really going to be much of a military threat to Russia, and they'd be very, very unwise at that point to want to join NATO, given everything that had just happened to them. So that's the main war aims that the Russians have in this recent invasion. It still obviously is early days at the time of doing this video. The Russians seem to have stalled somewhat, but it seems quite clear that the conquest of Ukraine isn't up for debate at the moment. But, you know, the situation can obviously like change in the interim period. In a few years' time, people be like, well, that was a quick war and stuff, yeah, or whatever. But the point is, at the moment, that's the situation on the ground. That's why Russia is doing what it's doing. And that's what their ultimate aims are. That's what Putin wants. And yeah, so let me know in the comment section what you think of that, right? And obviously don't forget to obviously hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already, and check out a whole lot more of our videos. We've covered pretty much every topic, yeah, that you can think of and stuff, right? But I want you to let me know in the comment section if you disagree with anything that I've said, if you kind of have any opposition to what I've said. In particular, I'd like to hear what you have to say in the comment section, yeah. Like if you think that I don't know, I'm making apologetics for Russia, etc., please let me know in the comment section, yeah, because I'd be very interested to kind of have those discussions. And yeah, so yeah, as we said, like kind of, you know, hit me up in the comment section, like the video, you know, like also as well, share the video, you know, sharing is caring. And in the meantime, have a great day and bye.